Hello and welcome to this book talk hosted by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We are here with Ken Vogel from the New York Times. So my name is Nick Cleveland Stout. I'm the research associate in the Democratizing Foreign Policy team here at the Quincy Institute. We are a transpartisan think tank here in Washington, D.C. that is working to build a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. In our research and writing, through our advocacy efforts, we're promoting ideas that move U.S. foreign policy and national security policy away from military adventurism. And in our program, we focus a lot of our efforts on how U.S. foreign policy is oftentimes steered by corporate and political interests rather than the public interest. And on that note, today I'm honored to welcome Ken Vogel to discuss his new book, Devil's Advocates: The Hidden Story of Rudy Giuliani, Hunter Biden, and the Washington Insiders on the Payrolls of Corrupt Foreign Interests. It's an amazing book. I'm excited to discuss it. Kenneth Paul Vogel is an American journalist and author who currently reports for the New York Times. From 2007 to 2017, he was the founding chief investigative reporter at Politico. In June 2017, he joined the Washington bureau of the New York Times as a reporter covering conflicts of interest, lobbying, and money in politics. In addition to Devil's Advocates, Vogel is the author of Big Money, $2.5 billion, One Suspicious Vehicle, and A Pimp on the Trail of the Ultra-Rich Hijacking American Politics. So Ken, I'm so excited to be chatting with you here today. And just a reminder to everyone tuning in, please put your questions as we continue our conversation in the Q&A. We're going to switch over to a Q&A at some point later in this discussion. And just to start with kind of a basic question, Ken, I'm dying to know, you've been covering this industry at the New York Times and Politico, and but why now and why this book? I mean, what made you want to write a book about the foreign lobbying industry?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. As I mentioned before, privately, I'm a fan of your work in this space, and so I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about this. And yeah, I mean, as you sort of read through my bio there, I mean, I covered traditional, what we think of as like traditional money in politics for many years, even before joining Politico at newspapers, small and medium-sized regional newspapers around the country. And what that meant was covering like, major donors to political campaigns or to political action committees or nonprofits, domestic donors, that is, who were trying to shape American politics. And is like I increasingly found as I wrote about this, like there was a lot of foreign money that was coming into the process that was not always as easy to trace. And we could talk about why later, but certainly the loopholes in the current regulatory regime, the current legal regime going back many years, but even more so the loopholes that were expanded in recent years, in the past year by the Trump administration, made it difficult to track, but that there was like a lot of like potential stories there, a lot of potential like scandal there, frankly. And we saw this bubble up in the most acute way during the first Trump administration with the Mueller investigation, when we saw a heightened focus on foreign influence and foreign lobbying in particular, that led to a bit of a clampdown and a retroactive effort by a number of these lobbyists who for years had been working under the radar without registering through the various disclosure requirements. And suddenly the pendulum had swung, and like there were a lot of scandals coming out of this, and there was a lot of effort to come into compliance with these laws, these previously ignored laws. And so that got me thinking, so with so many of the biggest sort of storylines and scandals shaping American politics coming out of foreign influence, like this was an industry that didn't really get as much attention as the domestic money in politics space, and seemed worthy of a book treatment. So, I think in some ways that decision was justified right up till today. I just published a story about the effort by Roger Stone and others to help win a pardon for Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of drug trafficking related crimes and sentenced to 45 years in prison, and just got pardoned and freed by Trump yesterday, or he got pardoned by Trump a few days earlier and freed yesterday. And so yet another example of the foreign influence industry like shaping our politics in a way that like I still don't think we know the full story of. But certainly, my desire to shine a spotlight on the broader themes and the dynamics behind this industry, what motivates foreign interests to pay these well-connected Americans, and what motivates these well-connected Americans to take this money to try to influence foreign policy in a way that is sometimes inconsistent with the sort of democratic ideals that we purport to embrace, in Washington of about democracy and human rights and freedom of expression and freedom of religion. There's something that unites a lot of these scandals from, the stuff that came out in the Mueller report and Manafort, to Hunter Biden's work, around the world during his father's vice presidency to this story of Juan Orlando Hernandez. So that's sort of the why of my decision to write this book.
It is pretty amazing that, m so many foreign policy decisions, there is an angle of foreign influence that you can find to this. Roger Stone playing a role in this pardoning being Exhibit A. I want to trace kind of the rise of the foreign influence industry with you for a second here. I mean, you start the book with Paul Manafort, and who is sort of like the OG foreign lobbyist in a lot of ways, or at least one that played a very significant role in the rise of foreign lobbying. And you talk about his rise, his fall again, his rise again. I think there might be one or two more rises and falls in there. It's kind of hard to keep up when it comes to Paul Manafort. But a lot of other characters even kind of like look up to him as an inspiration. And so, could you talk a little bit about Manafort? How did he pioneer modern foreign lobbying? And what kind of you mentioned that a lot of times the countries that are doing this kind of work are oftentimes not aligned with the U.S. And I think Manafort could be one key example of that. I mean, what did he do? What kind of clients did he work for, and how did he pioneer this profession?
Yeah, I mean, Manafort deserves a lot of credit or blame for like a number of the sort of like systemic dynamics that are at play with that, not just like the foreign influence game, but also domestic influence in politics. And so, like to trace the innovations that he introduced, you got to really go back to like, the Ford and Reagan campaigns. Really, the Reagan campaign is where it really sort of um, became clear that like there was like something here, something that was like quite lucrative for folks like Manafort and something that was like quite influential in American foreign policy. And so during the Reagan campaign, Manafort worked on the campaign and he was sort of well recognized as a really sharp strategic thinker on politics. And not long after Reagan won, Manafort and his partners, who actually included Roger Stone, interestingly, to bring it full circle, as well as Charlie Black, Lee Atwater, later Peter Kelly, who was a Democrat. They realized like it's you can elect these people and make a lot of money running campaigns. But where you can really make money is once you elect these people, helping deep-pocketed interest shape the decisions that the people who you just elected are making and shape the administration. So Manafort, Stone, Atwater, Charlie Black, they started a lobbying firm that was intended to do just that. And they actually had a saying at the lobbying firm, which I'm going to butcher, but because I can't remember the floors, but they said like it was a big building in Alexandria, right outside of Washington in the Northern Virginia suburbs, and they leased multiple floors in this office building, and one of the floors housed their lobbying operation, and one housed their political consulting operation, so they could have at least a little semblance of separation. But internally, they said, we elect them on the third floor, we lobby them on the fourth, or I may have that reversed. So that was what Manafort did, and that became known as like a double-breasted firm, having the lobbying and the political consulting in the same space. And so what Manafort, more than any of those other partners, realized is like if you can like market, like take this model of the double-breasted firm and take it international international, it really becomes almost like a triple-breasted firm because Manafort would go and he'd run these campaigns for foreign interests and he would help elect them. And then, while simultaneously his partners would be helping to elect the U.S. president and members of Congress and the Senate. And then he would go and tell these like foreign officials, like, hey, if you want to, I helped elect you, but if you want to be in the good graces of Washington, D.C., you should hire me to lobby for you. So oftentimes these are, quite brutal, blood-stained, politicians or dictators who he's like helping to elect, and I use the term loosely, in these far-flung parts of the world. And he would take them to Washington and be like, look, these guys, like, they may look bad on paper, but actually they could help like further American interests in this part of the world. And so that was, to be able to sell that that package abroad during the Reagan years and the Bush one years, George H.W. Bush, is a pretty simple formula. You would say like this Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines is a good example. He like helped run the campaigns, and then he was selling Marcos in Washington at a time when there was like real concern about Marcos's brutality and kleptocracy. Is like he is your bastion against the Soviets in the South Pacific or wherever. Another one was Jonas Savimbi, the really brutal guerrilla leader. Didn't run for anything, or I guess he did run at one point, but he was a guerrilla leader in Angola, and just this prosecuting this like just bloody civil war in Angola. But Manafort sold him in Washington as like, the Angolan government was tied to the Cubans and the Chinese and maybe the Russians. And Manafort said like, Jonas Savimbi is going to be your crusader against communism in Africa. And I talked to Manafort about this. This is quite recently after Jonas Savimbi, has been long dead, and in fact, like, but Manafort was seen as like extending the like, winning U.S. support. Military and financial support for Savimbi and extending that civil war for many years after it, otherwise would have faded out, even after like the Soviet Union fell. So like the argument is sort of like not as relevant, but he's still making the argument like we should keep on funding Savimbi, and we did. And there by the time that Savimbi was killed, which is the only thing that ended the Civil War, 500,000 people had been killed on all sides of this issue in Angola and its surrounds. And there was Bill Bradley, the former senator from New Jersey, said like that Civil War would have ended a lot sooner, and there would have been a lot fewer deaths were it not for Manafort's efforts. And I talked to Manafort about this, and I sort of put that to him, like, how can you justify doing this? This is maybe 2022 or 2023. We had lunch at Al Tiramisu, this great Italian restaurant at DuPont Circle. That's a good place to go if you want to overhear conversations by lobbyists. And he said that Savimbi was, quote, Reagan's freedom fighter against the Cubans, he told me. So like he's sort of justifying it. And then I said, like, well, what about more broadly? Like, you work for all these people. He was known, like his client book was known as the Torturers Lobby. The Center for Public Integrity deemed it that in a seminal like 1990s report. And Manafort explained it by saying, I never worked with a country that was contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests. That was the one criteria in everything that we did. But he admits the way I would balance it, I'm reading a quote that he gave me, it is if they were on the side of the U.S. Now, I say that in a broad way. U.S. foreign policy is called pro-democracy, but it's not always pro-democracy. It's pro-U.S. So like that's a real realpolitik view. And I think if you talk to some of these lobbyists who do this type of work, like that's what they'll say. That they won't say like, oh, this person isn't as bad as you think. They'll say like, yeah, maybe they're bad, but they can be like, isn't it better to have them be bad and on the U.S. side, or at least to have like a back channel between the U.S., whether it's the White House or the State Department or the CIA, and this country or this part of the world or this leader. Like, isn't it better that we have that open channel communication, which is sort of like the Trumpian view a little bit? He'll talk to Putin, he'll talk to Kim Jong-un, even as they're like key elements of their track records that are anathema to U.S. foreign policy interests. And so Manafort, that's his explanation for why he did it. And, it is true. Manafort, like during that time, he was talking to Bill Casey, who was the CIA director under Reagan and I think George H.W. Bush. And he was like the back channel. And, I think some of that is happening now in Venezuela. There are people who are outside of the U.S. government who are maybe making money, maybe not, but they are communicating. They're providing that sort of connective tissue between the U.S. and the Maduro regime. Obviously, Trump talked to Maduro on the phone, so there's obviously principal to principal communications there, but the idea is the same, which is that like that is the sort of best case, the best use case for this type of lobbying, that it can provide something that official U.S. foreign policy channels cannot. I think, though, that there are plenty of lobbyists who cite that argument disingenuously and are just taking the money from, foreign interests that have no interest in like changing their behavior or sort of being like a partner to the U.S. in parts of the world, and just want either the U.S. to stay off their back and out of the crosshairs of sanctions or tariffs or whatever, or actually want like foreign aid, despite being in some ways, like I said, anathema to like U.S. interests.
And I think one of the most fascinating parts of the book, in my view, was like the way in which you trace what happens when Trump is first elected, and kind of the fact that he's an outsider, the fact that it really shakes up K Street in a big way. One of the people that was really inspired by Manafort, I think that he actually referred to Manafort in one of your earlier chapters as his spirit animal, which is a great answer. Um, he was very inspired by Manafort, and is one of these people who made a lot of connections with foreign governments. And he's kind of the main character of your book, Robert Strick. And whereas other people might be aghast at representing Marcos or Savimbi, Strick was very much inspired by it, and tried to emulate him in some ways. And he's a fascinating character. Your book traces how he goes from his Oregon vineyard to becoming a bit of a foreign lobbyist cowboy, which might be an unusual career trajectory. And I say that as someone who myself worked in and out of Oregon vineyards. But talk to us a little bit about Robert Strick. Who is he? How does he make a name for himself? And why did you decide to make him kind of the main character of this book?
Yeah, I mean, he is a fascinating character, as you just sort of sketched out some of the traits that make him as such. But it's also that he is an outsider, and so, or he certainly was an outsider when he first broke into Washington, as was Trump in 2017. And so he sort of like approaches this dynamic and this industry with like fresh eyes. So my goal was to sort of use him as a device through which the readers could like come into this industry with their own fresh eyes and sort of follow it as they get deeper into it, and as Strick gets deeper into it and becomes like more savvy and understands it more, and makes more money from it. And so he was interesting in that way, like as a device, as well as for some of this very specific and interesting and quite pivotal geopolitical hotspots and dynamics that he found himself as a key player in. And the fact that he was able to do that as an outsider is really emblematic of like the first Trump administration and how Trump shook up. I mean, it continues to this day, the shakeup of like foreign policy under Trump and of Washington under Trump. It's just that now there is more of like an industry that is formed around him that is embracing, or sort of mirroring back at him like his worldview, in a way that like makes it harder for people to like burst onto the scene and instantly like get a foothold like Strick did. So yeah, I mean there were a lot of people who were like Strick in that first term, who were like kind of outsiders. They were either like regional players like outside of Washington but didn't really have a footprint in Washington, or they were just in the lower tiers of like Republican politics and Republican lobbying, and were unable to sort of penetrate this, quite cloistered world of DC gatekeepers who have long controlled, lobbying and K Street, and who gets access and who gets influence and who's able to raise a lot of money in Washington. And, that permanent professional class, in some ways, like Trump, he campaigned against it. He talked about draining the swamp. And like there was a moment where like the swamp was, it wasn't drained, but it was sort of like disrupted and on its back foot. And that allowed people who had been trying to break in, who didn't really have ties to like that traditional Washington professional class to do so, and Strick was one of them. And he had some ties to Trump. He had worked, or Trump world, I should say, like during the 2016 campaign. He was an informal advisor to Corey Lewandowski, who was the campaign manager, and interestingly was sort of an enemy of Paul Manafort. So even as Strick is idolizing Paul Manafort from the outside, he's working with a guy who's trying to defenestrate Paul Manafort. And of course, Paul Manafort initially won that fight with Corey Lewandowski, and Corey Lewandowski was ousted as the campaign manager, and Paul Manafort took the reins. But then Paul Manafort, quite tellingly, was defenestrated because of the sort of emerging Russia scandal with Russian influence. He had worked for this Ukrainian sort of pro-Russian, Russia-aligned Ukrainian strongman president in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and some of the stuff that he was doing and the way that he skirted FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and the amount of money that he made and the way that he made the money was sort of just coming into the public eye during the late stages of the 2016 campaign. And the scandal was sufficient enough to force to get Jared Kushner and the Trump kids to force Manafort out of the campaign. Anyway, Trump wins, and Strick is suddenly like finds those like quite cursory, ties to Trump world. I mean, not cursory, they were real ties, but they weren't like what you would think of as like the gold-plated connections to like the national security advisor or the Secretary of State in a way that like would be valued and coveted in the traditional Washington professional class. Strick is able to like market those quite successfully to foreign interest that had zero connection and had zero visibility into Trump world, because they were all planning for President Hillary Clinton, and they knew that their ties to the permanent professional class in Washington would be sufficient to give them entree into that world, because that's how Hillary Clinton would have staffed her presidential administration. But Trump came in, didn't have any of those types of traditional folks around him. And so suddenly there was an opportunity for folks like Robert Strick, Corey Lewandowski, even Paul Manafort, before prosecutors ended up bringing charges against him, was working in late 2016, after the election, in early 2017, to sign foreign clients with the promise that he could help them navigate this strange new world of an outsider president with zero ties to the foreign policy apparatus or the permanent professional class. And Strick was just a particularly vivid example of that, because the extreme of how little connections he had. I mean, you mentioned the winery. He had tried to open a security guard business. He had done some lobbying, but he was like definitely an outsider who should not have been collecting multi-million-dollar paydays from some of the most like important like geopolitical hotspots. He signed a $5.4 million contract within 5 months of Trump taking office with MBN, Mohammed bin Nayef, who was at the time the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He was since very, very quickly leapfrogged by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. But Mohammed bin Nayef like wanted to protect his flank from MBS, and so he needed someone. Even though Mohammed bin Nayef had all these, I talk about like gold-plated ties to American foreign policy, the apparatus and the intelligence community, that was insufficient under Trump. So he needed someone who had like at least the finger on the pulse of Trump world, if not connections to the people who are staffing the administration, so he doesn't turn to a traditional lobbyist like a BGR or someone like that. He turns to Robert Strick, because there was this moment where folks like him were able to break into the big leagues, and he certainly took advantage of it to the tune of tens of millions of dollars if you listen to him in that during that first Trump administration.
And some of the details in the book of how those connections are made I found fascinating. I mean, at one point he's sitting in a steakhouse and a dog runs up to him and he starts petting the dog. Turns out the owner of the dog is the number two in command at the New Zealand embassy. And the New Zealand embassy basically, hey, we'll sign you if you can produce Trump's phone number. And there's a very tense scene in which he finally is actually able to ask, through a friend of a friend or whatever, and be able to deliver on that, and show that he has some influence, and sign all these new clients.
Yeah, and that story is sort of emblematic of a couple things. Number one is New Zealand, like this is a Five Eyes ally who like should be able to like get the phone number, get a way to communicate. All they wanted to do was like open the channel communication and have the traditional like head of state to head of state congratulatory phone call that like is just de rigueur. Like that's the way Washington works. I'm sure they would have had it like that under President Clinton because they had worked so closely with her when she was Secretary of State during the Obama administration on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Deal, which fell apart under Trump. But they didn't have that connection, and so they needed someone who was, sort of like a little bit rogue outside of the traditional establishment to be able to get them that. And Strick, the other thing that it shows is like the sort of like gift of gab, the ability to kind of like excuse my French, but like bullshit a little bit, to be able to convince people like, yeah, this is a strange new world, and like I am your guide to it. And he was able to like both convince them of it and to produce the cell phone number that got through to Trump. Didn't in the initial call, they actually weren't able to connect the prime minister because there had just like moments earlier been a huge earthquake in New Zealand. But they established the sort of line of communication and were able to make that call. And he helped he helped the Kiwis, the New Zealand diplomats on a number of issues related to visas. And the like, he was unable, of course, to help them with their like top thing, which was saving the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump had vowed to do away with, as sort of part of his, protectionist approach to trade, and he did like quite quickly in his first term make good on that campaign promise. But that still that like call, the ability to set up that call, the ability to introduce the deputy chief of mission and the ambassador for the New Zealand, for the Kiwis to Washington, two key people in the Trump administration, the incoming administration, like that is valuable. Like that's not something to sneeze at. And like I said, it paid some dividends with the visa changes and the like, but not their big prize, which was saving this trade deal.
Right. And I want to reiterate for folks tuning in, please put your questions in the chat in the Q&A. We're going to turn to Q&A later on in this discussion. Um, and, speaking of New Zealand, though, it does strike me that later on, it seems like Strick over time gravitates towards more and more authoritarian clients. He starts kind of with New Zealand's this big get, but, he starts representing more and more authoritarian countries in the Middle East. And that's something that's always stood out to me about the foreign influence industry. Last year at the Quincy Institute, my colleague Ben Freeman and I, we wrote a policy brief trying to give kind of a 10,000 foot view of the foreign lobbying industry. And one of the findings that we had in that study was that the majority of the countries that engage or that are the most active in foreign lobbying are authoritarian countries, and especially authoritarian partners. Countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. And a lot of these countries come up in your reporting. One of the details I liked in the book, you talk about how Strick's firm helped through a sale of $300 million worth of rockets and missiles to Bahrain, which was supporting the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen at the time. There was an anecdote in there about how Senator Rand Paul, who was trying to block that sale, went ballistic. There may have been more expletives used by Senator Paul, so I'll keep it PG for folks. But he went ballistic on one of the lobbyists just for representing Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. You've talked about the arguments that these lobbyists employ to defend representing these kinds of countries, but why is it that so many authoritarian countries do engage in this practice?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons, and it's a great observation and one that I try to sort of weave the answers to throughout the book, in a way that like evolves naturally from the sort of storylines and the narrative, as opposed to stating it as an academic treatise. Although I did read the study that you guys did, which was great, and sort of got it quantified this dynamic in a way that I think is quite useful. But as far as like why the dynamic exists, a few reasons. Number one is like the more closely allied countries that like don't have the sort of taint of whether it's authoritarianism or issues with human rights or freedom of religion. they don't really need the lobbying as much. They have like the diplomatic channels are open traditionally. I mean, I just explained how that wasn't the case under Trump, and how even a country that was like unquestioned in its like allegiance to the U.S. Allegiance is the wrong word, but its relationship with the U.S. was like quite strong. New Zealand, they needed it during Trump won, but like a country like that typically does not need it because like they have long history of like being on the same side as the US on like any number of things. And it's only when there is an issue that they need to like bring in lobbying firepower. As to why the sort of the countries that are like tainted or have this sort of toxic aura about them pay more. Well, in a lot of cases, because they have more money, because they are like they're essentially like stealing it from their people and their kleptocracies. But also like there is a reputational risk that comes with representing countries like this, or regimes, or businesses, or whatever, oligarchs, and so the more, and I actually have Ben Friedman talking about this, I quoted in my book, but there's like a bit of like an oligarch premium. Like you got to pay more because like when it's revealed, if it's revealed that a U.S. like a well-connected American lobbyist is working for this country, it's going to like hurt them in some ways, hurt their reputation, and make it harder for them to sign like blue chip domestic clients or closely allied foreign clients, because like those prospective clients are going to be like, this person represents, Joseph Kabila in the example of Robert Strick. The Joseph Kabila was the dictator in the Democratic Republic of Congo for a number of years. Like we don't want any part of that. We don't want to like have a story in the New York Times that says like, New Zealand signed this lobbyist who's working for who's trying to keep Joseph Kabila in power after he's overstayed his term limits by many years. And so like that dynamic, this sort of like taint that comes, the reputational risk that comes from like representing, more sort of fringe foreign interest. It's sort of self-perpetuating because like the more you do it, the more you're like, the more you're ostracized by more mainstream candidates, and the more you sort of have to do it, and you chase the bigger paydays, which are sort of further, the more fringy and the more like reputational damage, the more baggage that these clients have, the more they have to pay because they understand the reputational risk, and because they have more issues. They have more issues with the U.S. that they want to sort of diffuse. They may be sanctioned, or they may be like at risk of sanction, or they may be on the tariff list, or they may be have travel restrictions against like top members of their regimes that are like quite damaging to them. So they're willing to pay more to resolve those and to protect their sometimes ill-gotten fortunes from U.S. Actions to sort of seize or forfeit some of their assets. So it's like a slippery slope. Once you start down it, it's hard to like reverse and come back and distance yourself from the more toxic clients to sort of strengthen your appeal to more mainstream clients. It tends to work the other way, that your appeal to even more toxic clients pulls you further down the slope, as opposed to something that you can kind of turn the page from and say, oh, that was a previous chapter where I represented that toxic foreign interest. No, that's like very hard to do.
So we've got a question here from Jennifer, and she asks, I'm somewhat aware of the people making big money in the Trump administrations, Manafort, Strick, and so on. Who are the people players for the Democrats, or is that the wrong way to think of these influencers? Foreign lobbying. A theme that I pick up on your book from a little bit is that foreign influence is somewhat of a bipartisan affair. You have Rudy Giuliani on the right, Hunter Biden on the left on your cover, and you dive into the host of foreign clients that they've represented throughout the book. So is it a fair read here that foreign influence is a bipartisan affair? What's going on the Democratic side, and in what ways does foreign lobbying change based on what party is in power?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely a bipartisan affair. During the Biden administration, like a key player was SKDK, was a firm that was run. The D in that is Anita Dunn, who helped run the Obama campaign, but then the Biden campaign, and then went into the White House. And had like a number of a number of like employees who were like in and out of the Biden administration, sort of in the mold of that permanent professional class that goes through the revolving door between government and the influence sector. And they represented a number of foreign interests trying to secure support in Washington during the first Trump administration, as well as interest clients that were seeking to diffuse opposition, like TikTok, for instance. The Biden administration was exploring the TikTok ban. They tried to neutralize criticism of that. They also registered a lobby at one point for the Ukrainian government. They had like an Israeli spyware firm that they worked for that was facing, legitimate questions about like the use of the spyware is called Pegasus, and the company was NSO Group. I think they've changed the name now, but it was used by like quite, brutal regimes to like go after dissidents. So they had like a real PR problem. So they hired SKDK to do it. So it's bipartisan, and even more than like bipartisan, where it shifts from like administration to administration, where like, now that Trump is in power, like there's all these foreign interests that want to hire people close to Trump. It's even like during administration, particularly when there's like split power in Washington, like Democrats will control one or both chambers of Congress and Republicans will control the White House, or vice versa. A good example of this is Manafort, and that actually, you know what, I will instead, because we talked a lot about Manafort, I'll introduce Hunter Biden. A good example of it is this. During the Obama administration, there was this Romanian oligarch who was being prosecuted by Romanian prosecutors for like a corrupt land deal, but the prosecution was supported by the U.S. government, by the Obama administration, and even more to the point, by Joe Biden himself, because Joe Biden sort of had this role in the Obama administration as like the global statesman who would go around to our like ostensible allies and tell them, hey, like to keep the flow of U.S. assistance coming, you got to fight the corruption problem in your own country. So there was in Romania, and Biden gave a speech that said essentially what I just said to the Romanian parliament and Romanian sort of the civil sector. And he said that, and so one of the top targets of the prosecutions of the anti-corruption prosecute sort of initiative that he was encouraging was this real estate magnate. Well, he turns around and hires Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, to essentially, I mean, he admits this, to try to get in my book, to try to get to try to get the U.S. to get the Romanians to back down. And so there's all kinds of stuff that happens with Hunter. He's like trying different things. He's going to meet with the U.S. ambassador to Romania to like feel him out on it. He's trying to get his like Chinese paymasters to maybe buy the disputed land off of the Romanian. And by the way, the disputed land includes the land on which the U.S. embassy in Bucharest was built. So if Hunter was successful there, he would have actually like helped engineer a transaction under which the Chinese would buy the land, at least around, if not the land on which the U.S. embassy in Bucharest sat, which you could imagine would create all kinds of security, operational security, information security issues. But so Hunter's working for this guy, and then Trump wins. And in 2016, Hunter brings in Louis Freeh, the former FBI director under both parties, under Clinton, but also under Bush, who is a Republican, to try to help diffuse the Romanian prosecution. And then Louis Freeh brings in Rudy Giuliani to sort of be the Trump whisperer in this operation. And by that point, Hunter Biden had left. But you see right there, you have a client who's in the crosshairs of the U.S. government, government because he's done something that the U.S. government deems to be quite bad, who hires first a Democrat, and then when a Republican comes in, who hires a Democrat who is related to the vice president, the Democratic vice president at the time. And then when Trump comes in, he hires a Republican, Rudy Giuliani, who has Trump's ear to try to get out of trouble. And ultimately, the guy does get out of trouble. It's tough to say, like it is with all these things. How much whether there was a direct causal relationship between what the lobbyists or the unregistered lobbyists in the case of Hunter Biden did and the result, but there was a result. The guy got what he wanted, and he's currently, I think he's living in London, but the case is gone. It is a truly bipartisan thing, and the most sophisticated of the foreign clients recognize that and will have people who they'll hire lobbyists who have ties in both Republican and Democratic politics, depending on which administration is in power or what they need from the Hill versus the White House versus the State Department. And it's a way that like a lot of these people, a lot of these like well-connected Americans who, fight they fight quite publicly in the U.S. in domestic politics, like Rudy Giuliani and Hunter Biden did, quite famously during the first Trump administration and since. And yet they're willing to go abroad and take money that's not from like the red team in the U.S. or the blue team in the U.S., but the green team overseas. That being like anyone who's willing to pay them the right amount.
There was another little vignette towards the end of your book where you're talking about one of the lobbyists who used to work for Strick, and he was playing up all of his ties to the Harris campaign, in particular Tim Walz, in the run-up to the 2024 election, and posting on social media about it, all these things. And eventually, when Trump wins, he scrubs any mention of the Democrats on his website and starts to play up the Republican ties. So, like you said, the green team wins out. We've got a question from Arthur who says, do these players always register as foreign lobbyists under U.S. law, and how would you apprise U.S. enforcement? I'm going to tack it on with another question that I just have about kind of how the foreign influence game has changed. In some of these old school days, like with people like Manafort, it seems like a lot of their job was to help them navigate Washington, whitewash their reputations, even something as simple as picking out a suit for them to wear. Today, and especially with social media, it seems like there's so many different avenues for influence. Do you see foreign governments adopting a lot of these new strategies? Like trying to influence social media, and is a law like FARA, which is the law that Arthur here is referencing, equipped to cover all of these new avenues of influence?
Yeah, I mean, the last part of the question, no, is the answer. It's not equipped to do it, and Arthur's and that's partly because it's like quite old. I mean, it was initially enacted and signed into law in 1938 as an attempt to prevent Nazi propaganda from being introduced into the U.S. information ecosystem at a time, without that being apparent, without it being clear that this was Nazi propaganda, at a time when the U.S. information ecosystem was like a lot simpler. It involved like newspapers and mailers and stuff like that. So that's what FARA is designed to capture. It's not designed to capture, online activity. It's not designed to capture. In fact, it officially exempts like legal activity. So there's sort of like a legal loophole where people like Hunter Biden, who did not register for this Romanian guy. And by the way, I should say, it's not just my judgment that he was like an unregistered, therefore like illegal foreign lobbyist. Prosecutors in his tax case late was it late last year or yeah, it was last year. They were trying to get him to plead guilty to tax violations, and they said like, hey, we're not charging you with FARA, but like we could charge you with violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act based on your work for this Romanian real estate magnate, which he did not register for. So like there's a long tradition of like not registering. It's what got Paul Manafort in trouble. And then, like I said initially, like there was, the pendulum swung during the first Trump administration, where there was a lot of attention and resources being put into enforcement of this law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and a lot of people did register, including retroactively, including some of the for one of the firms that Hunter Biden brought in to work for another client, this Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma. They didn't register at the time when they were doing it. And then when the clampdown was happening, they did register. Well, the pendulum has sort of swung back towards a more laissez-faire approach towards enforcing this, and it actually made clear in quite a poignant way by Pam Bondi, who was one of her first acts as Attorney General. And I should back up and say Pam Bondi herself, a former registered lobbyist for the state of Qatar, so she has experience in this sort of foreign influence space. But one of her first acts as Attorney General in Trump 2.0 was to announce that she was essentially decriminalizing the enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act as well as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, another statute that is used to sort of regulate and oversee the foreign influence industry. And she said that instead of allocating resources towards prosecuting cases in this space, we're just going to treat it more as like an advisory thing where we're going to focus on compliance and helping to bring people in compliance into compliance by registering instead of like charging them with not registering, charging them with being out of compliance. So that's one reason why it's insufficient to be able to track this. That is that there's not sufficient. There's not a focus on enforcement. In fact, there's a focus away from enforcement. But to your question, Nick, about like the new dynamics and the new sort of tools of the foreign influence industry and their the way that FARA like is not sufficient or modern enough to capture them. Like a lot of this stuff is happening online now. There's a lot of like foreign interests that are paying people to tweet about stuff, and you don't see them disclosing it. I should say there are some who do disclose it. You have noted this in your work that Rod Blagojevich, the former governor of Illinois, who went to jail for political corruption and was pardoned by Trump, and is now back out and is doing sort of some of this foreign influence stuff, including for a guy who is a dictator of the Republic of Srpska, this Serbian autonomous region within Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Rod Blagojevich is getting paid to represent him, and he is tweeting like and one of the things that he's doing is tweeting messages about how U.S. Sanctions against this guy were, part of a politicized prosecution by the Biden administration, which is sort of the way that you treat things, the way that you like lobby, for all interests, but particularly foreign interests in the Trump administration now, is you don't say like, this is our bastion against communism in like the Balkans. You say like, this person, like you, Mr. President, was persecuted by politically motivated prosecutors. So Rod Blagojevich was one of the people who was delivering that message. And on his tweets in which he would say things like this, he would write like, this message is, pursuant to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and list his registration number. And that's like quite rare. You don't often see that, but and so there are many more people who are delivering those types of messages while being paid by either foreign interest or the lobbyists or public relations people for foreign interest, and not revealing that they are being paid. And like it's I don't even know whether you could have a FARA prosecution. They might argue, oh, I'm just a journalist, even though I'm being paid by this person. Like this is freedom of the press. Or they would argue, I wasn't paid by a foreign interest. I was paid by this lobbying firm. I didn't know where they got the money. And so we actually did see charges brought against these influencers who were taking money. It was actually, I take it back. There were charges brought by DOJ against sort of a middle person, a company that was taking money from the Russians and then paying that money to the influencers, who were then doing podcasts and posts that were sort of aligned with Russian interests. But the influencers themselves did not get charged. It was the middle person who got charged. So right there, you see like the difficulty in tracking this and using this law to sort of keep up with the new ways in which foreign money is flowing into our politics to try to influence our policy debates and our foreign policy decision making.
Right. And if I remember correctly, I mean, the influencers themselves were also saying, we had no idea about the origins of this, people like Tim Pool. We got a few questions here. Something that jumps out in reading this book is that every group of people is trying to signal something different. The incentives are set up so that the lobbyists have to signal their influence to the clients. The clients have to signal their success to their higher ups to justify hiring the lobbyists. The U.S. government oftentimes has to signal their independence from these lobbyists, and all of that can make it really difficult to clearly track influence and quantify it in a way. I think most memorably, you had Robert Strick claiming that he helped fix that election in the DRC that you were talking about. And so we've got a few questions from Jeff and Anthony about this. They're asking, how do we know that U.S. foreign policy is for sale? How can we and how do you kind of parse through, make heads of what's real, what's not, and parse out the impact of this enormous influence industry?
Yeah, those are great questions, and they do get to like a fundamental um, sort of point or like stumbling block that when it comes that does make it difficult to like track this in a way that like brings it home to people where they see like a causal relationship between like here's the money paid by this like sometimes corrupt, sometimes brutal, blood-stained foreign interest to this lobbyist to a policy outcome. And I think you synopsize it perfectly. The US government is going to deny every time, even if like the lobbyists were key in shaping a decision because they don't want to make it look like they're doing some corrupt backroom deal. And yes, and it's also in the interest of the lobbyists to exaggerate their influence. And I think it's like this dynamic is also, and this sort of like enigma is also in play with domestic lobbying, but like domestic lobbying and domestic policy making is in some ways like more transparent because like in a lot of most stuff has to go through Congress, and so you see like a debate often in public, and there's many more sort of potential leak points for journalists to go to figure out how something happened, and that's not the case with foreign policy, which happens much more behind closed doors and much more unilaterally within the administration. So it is hard to trace it, but like I mean, in some ways, you like the best you could do is just lay out the facts. So this case that I talked about with Republic Srpska and the president of Republic Srpska, he had been sanctioned since the Obama administration, and those sanctions remained in place during the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. And it was only in Trump's second administration, and he had been, by the way, he'd been pushing the dictator had been pushing to get off sanctions. So it wasn't like he was just sitting back taking it. He wanted to be off sanctions, but it wasn't until the set right before this. So after Trump is elected the second time, and right before Trump is inaugurated, that he starts hiring these people who are like quite close to Trump and influential in Trump world, hiring some of them directly, like Rod Blagojevich, some of them indirectly. Rudy Giuliani is paid by someone, we don't know exactly who, to go over to Republic Srpska and tape a podcast with the guy. Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor for Trump, starts tweeting about it. The guy hires Tactic Global. It's a new and emerging lobbying firm with like very close ties in Trump world. That his government, I think, hires. Maybe I'm misremembering. I'll stop there. Anyway, so he hires all these people, and the sanctions get lifted. And like, yeah, sure, there are alternative arguments. The Trump administration is trying to like open channels of communication with like non-traditional allies, is like being a little more like of the using the carrot as opposed to the stick. And so it is possible that like the lobbyists played no role. But if you look at just the chronology of it, the one thing that changed, this guy had been trying to get these sanctions lifted for years. The one thing that changed was this lobbying campaign, and it did definitely inject it. Oh, Laura Loomer was also tweeting about it, another one where there's like a lot of questions about like her her finances and the finances behind her various efforts. So, I think like a logical person would look at that and conclude that probably the lobbying did play some role. I mean, this like Tactic Global, this firm that I talked about, they very quickly they were signed to represent this guy, this dictator in Serbska, and they get him a meeting with Rick Grinnell, who's like a super influential person in the Trump orbit. He's like a special envoy without real portfolio, but like that sends a real message. And it's hard to imagine that it didn't have some effect on Trump and the State Department and OFAC and the Treasury and their decision to lift the sanction. But even if it didn't, the messaging like internally, domestically in Serbska to be able to show like here's the president meeting with Rick Grinnell and here's the president, on a podcast with Rudy Giuliani, like that's helpful and valuable there, even if it isn't ultimately buying the lifting of the sanction, even if like the foreign policy outcome isn't for sale. And by the way, I'm not like totally convinced that it isn't, but just sort of showing that like the difficulty in assessing the cause and effect, and also showing that even if the ultimate goal is not achieved, in this case it was, but even if it wasn't, there's some value in affiliating in like the paid affiliation with the US president and his administration that is worthwhile for these foreign interests that have the money to pay for it.
All right, so this will probably be the last question that we have time for, but we've got a question from T. Listo saying, "Can you speak a bit to America's dueling consultants? You have Black Manafort Stone advising Marcos. You have Sawyer Miller, which is more Democrat aligned, advising Cory Aquino in the Philippines, and you have similar dynamics playing out in Gabon, Korea." Burma in the early to mid 90s, and it goes on today. You talk in your book, for instance, about a few examples of kind of these rivaling factions competing to curry favor in Washington. I think that's something that might surprise some people who aren't looking in the weeds on FARA filings, that there are a lot of these competing interests that are trying to win favor. Can you talk a little bit about that phenomena and how do these rivaling factions compete with one another and does it play a role in kind of who wins out?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And like the first time that I became aware of this dynamic of like foreign influence and the sort of blurry line between like US politics and foreign lobbying was in 2009. I was at Politico and Ben Smith, a colleague of mine at the time, and I wrote a story about it was right after Obama had either he was elected and it was either preparing to take office or he had already taken office. And there was a presidential campaign in Ukraine, and a number of the candidates had like tried to hire people who were associated with, and it was a particular situation because like both John McCain, who lost to Obama, and Obama were like quite popular around the world, and even though Obama had won, it was like a rare moment of sort of bipartisan unity, and so we in the U.S. And so these different Ukrainian candidates hired like people from so Paul Manafort were working for Viktor Yanukovych, the guy who described as sort of the Russia-aligned strongman president, but he recruited like Tad Devine, who had worked for John Kerry and would go on to work for Bernie Sanders. And then there was another candidate, this Yulia Tymoshenko, was like the leading rival of Yanukovych, and she hired people who had run Obama's campaign. And then there was another candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, who had hired candidates who were like associated with some other Democratic campaigns. And so they all sort of wanted the same thing. They wanted like to be seen as like the American candidate. And if they won, wanted ties in Washington, but they had like competing sort of ideas about how to do that. And you do see that with lobbying. I mean, you see that both like, where there are like there are like sort of rival domestic factions that are jockeying for power in their far-flung perch. And the way that they do that is like they'll each hire someone who they think is like close to Trump to try to like, get position, get the pole position and sort of being seen as like the Trump aligned faction in their country. Or it will be like regional rivals, India and Pakistan. They'll each try to hire, and they have hired like people who are close to Trump. Pakistan hired his former bodyguard, Keith Schiller, who was the director of Oval Office operations during the first term and now has his shingle out as a lobbyist. And India has hired Jason Miller, who was a former spokesman for Trump. So yeah, you see these like regional disputes playing out in Washington through the hiring of these like well-connected sort of whisperers to the administration, whichever administration it is, and I think it does have an impact. If nothing else, it like shapes the way that these foreign interests frame their messaging, and a lot of it now is, oh, dear Mr. Trump, like I too was unfairly targeted by politicized prosecutions and the deep state, and I love you and you're great, and please give me a pardon or lift sanctions or give money to my like regime. And we're seeing again with this pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez that this works.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to you, Ken Vogel. This has been an excellent discussion. I've learned so much from it. And thank you to everyone who came to participate today and ask questions. Before I let you go, let me mention that our next webinar, Trump's Gaza Plan and What It Means for Palestinians, will be held on December 11th at noon Eastern Time. You can register for that by going to our events page, quincyinst.org/events. You can also subscribe to the Quincy mailing list from our homepage, quincyinst.org, so you'll receive invitations to all of our events and be able to follow our work. Thank you again to Ken, and thank you again for participating today. I have a feeling a lot of the foreign influence stuff will continue past this webinar. So thank you so much, and thanks for joining our efforts to promote ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war towards military restraint and diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. Have a great rest of your day.